I am so glad you could join me for another message from the wilderness. The American ideal includes the notion that America strives to lift her vanquished foes so that they might become allies, rather than the enemies that they had been. This is one of many ideals that have been imperfectly applied throughout our history. Nevertheless, when we consider the remarkable successes we have achieved, when we've tried to live up to the standard, we ought to keep striving for the ideal, instead of giving in to the temptation to inflict ongoing punishment on adversaries we have defeated. History also shows that humiliated enemies have a tendency to regain strength and resolve, appearing again and again to fight against those viewed as their oppressors. This is, in fact, one of the most predictable patterns in all of human history, across all peoples and all nations of the world. How can we avoid this vicious cycle? President Abraham Lincoln famously said, "Do I not destroy my enemies when I make them my friends?" Perhaps no American president understood the wisdom of lifting the conquered to friendship better than did Abraham Lincoln. During America's devastating Civil War, he remained deeply concerned with the condition of the southern states. He wanted to be sure that when the war was over, the nation could be reunited with bonds of mutual friendship and respect that were stronger than they had ever been. However, his visionary ideal feared and angered many who wanted to impose vengeance on the South after those states had been militarily defeated. It would have been easy for Lincoln to appease these hateful sentiments, which seemed so justified at the time. But he had a clearer view of America's future. In his second inaugural address, delivered on March 4, 1865, about 1 month before the Civil War officially ended, he gave us these prophet-like words: "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." These inspiring words were consistent with leadership throughout his presidency. Carl Sandburg's biography of Abraham Lincoln concludes, "Lincoln's view favored a speedy reconstruction on terms that would be the least humiliating to the people who had rebelled against their government." It was not unpleasant for Lincoln to look back and consider that in all his speeches and papers, no one could find a phrase of hate or personal evil wish against the head of the Confederate government. We're left to wonder how our nation's history might have been different if his leadership could have continued. But on April 15, 1865, President Lincoln was assassinated and the mantle of the presidency passed to Vice President Andrew Johnson. When Andrew Johnson became president, U.S. Senator Benjamin Wade from Ohio remarked, and I quote, "Mr. Johnson, I thank God that you are here. Lincoln had too much of the milk of human kindness to deal with these damned rebels. Now they will be dealt with according to their deserts." End of quote. His views are consistent with those of many others at the time. Biographer Carl Sandburg noted, "The single event of the assassination swept away 1,000 foundations carefully laid and protected by the living Lincoln. A long series of delicate roots of human relationships the living Lincoln had nursed and guarded were torn up in a night." The reconstruction of the South is a story of mostly unchecked human nature, and the scars of the same are not entirely healed to this day, as mistrust between regions of the U.S. resurface again and again, sometimes inflamed by those who profit from their resurrection. As noted, if a defeated enemy is not lifted into friendship, in time embers of the battle will ignite again. Later, the U.S. learned this lesson through another tragedy, World War I, the so-called War to End All Wars. It was concluded with the same invective that some wanted to unleash on the American South at the end of the Civil War. The 1919 Treaty of Versailles required the defeated nation of Germany and her allies to pay enormous reparations to the Allied powers. Germany was given the heaviest obligations, and the enormity of the challenge led to another vicious cycle of humiliating defeat, followed by renewed hostilities. A British economist, John Maynard Keynes, could see the tragedy that would unfold due to the heavy reparations. In 1919, he wrote a book titled The Economic Consequences of the Peace, which included a stern warning to the Allied powers. I quote, "If we take the view that for at least a generation to come, Germany cannot be trusted with even a modicum of prosperity, that while all our recent allies are angels of light, all our recent enemies, Germans, Austrians, Hungarians, and the rest, are children of the devil, that year by year Germany must be kept impoverished and her children starved and crippled, that she must be ringed by enemies, heaven help us all. If we aim deliberately at the impoverishment of Central Europe, vengeance, I dare predict, will not limp. Nothing can then delay for very long the final civil war between the forces of reaction and the despairing convulsions of revolution, before which the horrors of the late German war will fade into nothing, and which will destroy whoever is victor, the civilization and progress of our generation." End of quote. Keynes was right. The German people, desperate and humiliated, unable to pay the reparations imposed upon them by the war, finally rallied around one of history's most despotic tyrants, Adolf Hitler, who promised to make Germany a great nation again. World War II, the Holocaust, and every other terror that engulfed the world during the darkness of that horrible conflict might have been avoided if Lincoln's wisdom and Keynes' warning had been heeded. That is, the only way we can defeat an enemy is by making him our friend. After World War II, perhaps humbled by the pride of the previous World War, the Allied powers pursued a different course. Instead of adding to the wounds of Germany and Japan and Italy following their defeat, the US-led effort sought to rebuild their economies and civilizations through the Marshall Plan and the Yoshida Doctrine, shifting these deadly former enemies into strong and trustworthy allies. The effort largely succeeded. Former enemies emerged as allies, though it was not thought possible just a decade or two before. Of course, the historical events are more complex than can be summarized in this brief message, but the outcome is without dispute. Enemies really can be destroyed when they are made our friends. Going further back in U.S. history, we note an obscure phrase in the Constitution found in sections 9 and 10 of Article 1. This almost unnoticed phrase says simply, "No bill of attainder shall be passed." Well, what is a bill of attainder? Bills of attainder had a centuries-long history in England. Essentially, they were political weapons. A monarch with the support of Parliament could pass a law punishing one or more defeated political opponents who were then not given judicial review. Property, status, and even lives of political opponents could be legally taken by the government through legislative action without any recourse to the judiciary. Bills of attainder are sometimes called trial by legislature. They negate the doctrines of separation of powers, avoiding legal precedent and the rule of law completely. Times past, they were also called bills of pains and penalties. They were the means by which vengeful victors could crush, humiliate, and insult their already defeated opponents. We should note that during the Revolutionary War era, the U.S. did enact bills of attainder against British loyalists. Lands, homes, goods, and other possessions were confiscated by the victorious colonists. Consequently, tens of thousands of impoverished British loyalists fled to Canada and other countries. However, by the time the U.S. Constitution was ratified on June 21, 1788, there were no dissenting votes for excluding bills of attainder. Legal scholars seem to agree that the nation's new leaders recognized by then the serious threat bills of attainder posed to the rule of law. So what do bills of attainder and Lincoln's wisdom of destroying enemies by making them our friends have to do with our current political situation in the U.S.? Tragically, the lessons of the past may need to be relearned again, as the Trump administration has issued executive orders to punish political opponents, who are then deprived of constitutionally guaranteed judicial review. In particular, at least 5 large law firms have been singled out by executive orders for activities deemed to be a threat to the Trump administration. Sanctions have been imposed, including suspension of security clearances, termination of government contracts, and restrictions preventing firm employees from accessing federal buildings. In addition to violating the provisions against bills of attainder, these sanctions are also viewed as violations of the First, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments of the Constitution. None of the law firms are being sanctioned for illegal activities, only for past activities counter to Trump administration priorities. In English legal tradition, kings were unable to enact bills of attainder without approval of Parliament. Currently, executive orders in the U.S. enable the president to do so unilaterally, thus asserting a power denied even to kings in our legal tradition. Quoting from an article posted on justsecurity.org on April 9, 2025, quote, America's constitutional order reserves to the judicial branch alone the power to determine guilt and impose punishment following due process. Executive orders that bypass this structure threaten not just the legal profession, but the very separation of powers that shield every citizen from the arbitrary exercise of authority the framers so deeply feared. End of quote. When I consider these developments, I fear that what I've described in this message is only a small portion of unchecked executive power. Not only is this behavior counter to the Constitution, it is also counter to the wisdom of Abraham Lincoln and other wise people who have tried to steer humanity to a higher plane than we are normally found. All of the world's great spiritual traditions include some kind of counsel advising us to return good for evil. Yet some seem to be quite determined to reject this counsel, acting somewhat like the Allied powers after World War I. We allow or we tacitly endorse the moral equivalent of bills of attainder to legally punish those with whom we disagree. Can we ask ourselves what the likely outcomes will be? If history is our guide, and I believe it surely ought to be, those punished by legal but morally deficient and even unconstitutional means will not forget their humiliation. Human nature's vicious cycle will continue, and hostilities will intensify and be reignited again and again. Believing that ideas can be crushed by hostility is a deception. Ideas and hearts can only be changed by better ideas and better intentions. As my father used to say often, a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. If we want to hope for better tomorrows in our country, we need to remember the lessons taught by Abraham Lincoln and our own actions following World War II. It seems so sadly unnecessary to fall back to the mistakes made after World War I and other times in our history when we've decided to prioritize vengeance rather than healing. Until next time, I want to wish you all the best from the wilderness.